Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. It's fantastic to see such a great crowd here, and it's really good that you've remembered all your school lessons so nobody's in the front row. I mean, it's perfect. My name's Gus O'Donnell. I'm the chair of Pro Bono Economics. We're hosting the event tonight. Pro Bono Economics, for those of you who don't know, and I hope there's no one here in that category, basically is all about measuring impact, understanding the social impact of charities, policies, etc., and trying to find ways to measure it, and using highly skilled economists to do that. And actually we're open to working with lots of disciplines as well, but that's our core. Thanks tonight to our sponsors, Nomura, and to YouGov, who've provided some interesting survey results, which I hope you had a chance to look at, on education and social mobility. As far as pro bono concerned, education, improving well-being is absolutely vital to what we do. So we are desperate to work on helping charities, governments, anyone, create evidence bases to see what works and what doesn't. And that, I think, is fundamental to where we are. Education, as we all know, and I think I'd be talking to converted here, if you get at people early, it makes a big difference and can save you an enormous amount. I think David and I spent a lot of our life in government talking about spending more on prevention and less on cure as a kind of principle, which worked very well. So, on that cue, let me introduce our speaker today, Dr. David Halpern, Chief Executive of the Behavioural Insights team, which we all know as the Nudge team. David set it up in 2010. I was also there. I'm proud to claim some part of that, but it was fantastic. David had come in as an academic from Cambridge. He'd written lots of very serious books, and as you would expect, an academic coming into the civil service under Tony Blair, who's very up for public sector reform, was a complete pain in the neck for the civil service. Absolute, kept coming up with ideas, challenges, kept telling us that possibly we were doing stuff without any evidence that it ever worked, which was very, very annoying, right? I mean, you can't tell people have been working very hard, and he says, why? And well, cause. He did transform that, and the Nudge unit, I think, has been rapidly changing that ever since, for not just the UK, but now internationally. And you'll hear all about that. He's done lots of things, written lots of books. The most recent one, Inside the Nudge Unit, which I recommend to you all, but if you get him afterwards and give him a couple of drinks first, he will tell you the real story about what working with Steve Hilton was really like, because he was a blue skies thinker, and sometimes the sky was very blue around Steve. So, with those irreverent remarks, I hand you on to his... And the plan of tonight is David will speak, then the panel here, I will introduce the panel, we'll have a little chat, but then as soon as I can, I'll get it open to all of you. Please do not be hesitant. The idea of this is, insofar as one can with 300 people, to have a conversation and to learn from each other. But first of all, David, over to you.
Right. Gus obviously is much too modest. Frankly, the Nudge unit wouldn't have happened without Gus there, even before the 2010 administration, the work was done by Cabinet Office and so on, and in fact long before that. So in the Blair administration, work on well-being and many other areas. So Gus is, as ever, far too modest, been an incredibly significant figure for a very long time. So what I'm going to try and talk today is just rapidly, we'll use some examples. Nudge-u-cation, it seems to be the title. I have to remember the book Nudge, the word itself wasn't the original title, it was libertarian paternalism. And someone said, wouldn't it be better to call it Nudge? So who knows whether Nudge-u-cation will go on in a similar way. Just to encapsulate, there are two elements that really matter, I think, which is why pro bono is particularly the right place to rehearse these arguments. One is trying to introduce into policy a more realistic model of human behaviour, which might seem obvious, but actually is quite a radical thing to have happened. But the other thing, which is maybe less obvious, but people in this room would understand, which is to introduce essentially much more robust empirical methods into government and policy. My own view is that history will judge the latter was probably the most important thing that's happened in the last 10 years. And if BIT helped with that, I think that's a great thing. So, moving on. So very brief background, and I'm going to theme really about some particularly educational examples. If we've got a bit of time, I try and get into some other mobility issues. My own kind of summary view is one of the great things about this area is it's opening up new kinds of policy levers, and I'll hope to give you a glimpse into that way. Maybe we can be a bit more optimistic about what might be possible going forward. So, as Gus said, the origins of the Behavioural Insights team go back to 2010 in particular, Steve Hilton, etc. And the words of the coalition agreement, our government will find intelligent ways to encourage, support and enable people to make better choices for themselves. So it was partly in contrast, therefore, to conventional regulatory or indeed economic solutions. It was also true that government was broke, which might have helped focus minds. And of course, you had a centre-right government, which was generally trying to say, is there an alternative than more regulation? We've had a lot of help from our friends. There's Richard Thaler, who was involved right from the start, and lots of other folks. We have the additional, of course, ka-ching legitimacy now of Richard having got this year's Nobel Prize, which we're all delighted about. Because a rare example that incited for the evidence was the work of Her Majesty's government in relation to BIT, so that's great. Okay, so I'm going to just jump to some quite rapid examples, about sort of 5 of them I'll flip through. Particularly around education. But I thought I'd start with this example, which Gus will remember. It was one of the early ones which we did, which was, could you get people back to work faster? And some of this started actually in one particular job centre, which was Loughton, actually, where, and partly the significance of it is we did randomisation across the 2 floors. Because is that perfectly random? Someone has to go up some steps. But the basic idea was, could you get someone back to work faster by using what seemed like relatively subtle cues or differences? So for 30-odd years, we've used active welfare policy, which is you have to come into a job centre and you have to show that you're looking for work. So you have to say, these are the 3 jobs I looked for last week, and you have to fill in lots of paperwork, etc. So we spent quite a while doing ethnography and so on to see, could we get under the skin of this and see, is there a better way of doing this? So for example, from a sort of behavioural economic perspective, as it were, why would you ask about last week? Why wouldn't you ask about next week? In particular, body of work around so-called implementation intentions. If you prompt someone to think about what, where, when, they're more likely to do it. So we had job seekers do things like this. I'll show one example where they were basically asked to make a commitment for themselves to try and think through, and they would write it down themselves, what they're going to do in the coming week. So I'm going to spend 2 hours every day after breakfast searching, etc. And they'd also write down the outcome and fill it in themselves. So that's the kind of change. There were a number of them. So we ran this a randomised controlled trial, and we saw quite a decent effect. Just to be sure, we then changed it into, we did a regional effect, because you might think spillover effects. We did a step wedge design across Essex, in fact, it was done. And I'll show you, these are the results which we found. They were smaller, but nonetheless, that was our control group, back at work at 13 weeks as the measure. And then the treatment group, and it's a couple of percentage points, but it's a highly significant effect. And indeed, if we quantify that, which we've done since, you can work out, well, the 800,000 odd job seekers at any point in time, this is sort of 5 to 10 million days extra, if you work out in days, of benefits, etc., let alone all the scarring effects. But it's a little tiny glimpse into this world of, actually it's really significant if you say to someone, what are you going to do next week? And prompt when and where, and how many jobs, try and encourage them, and then they write it down themselves. So if it's possible to do it in that kind of area, and it's really important, and by the way, it particularly works, but most of the effect is concentrated on those whose job search is the most disorganised, who are the ones who we're most worried about. So that's pretty exciting, actually, as a result. Well, can we apply it in other areas? In fact, we sometimes give the example of, it's quite hard to regulate in Parliament to say, hey, you at the back, will you please pay attention in class, right? And even an economic incentive will struggle with a problem like that. But can you use these sort of more subtle approaches? So I'm going to give you a few educational examples, so some of which we published over the last year or so on. But one simple example is getting more applications to competitive universities. So when you look across schools, one of the things you'll see is certain schools, despite even the great attainment, very few kids are applying to the more elite universities. And could you do something about it? Quite a lot of money is spent now, sort of 800 million odd in the sector, to try and encourage kids to go onto university and access arrangements, basically. So in this case, we're doing something really simple, which was to get a letter written. So we actually, I really can't read the detail of it, but it was actually this letter was written by 2 students. They had to sign them. There were 5,000 letters that went out in this, by the way, because they had to sign a lot of letters. But it says stuff like this. You can see a bit of a sample of it. Back in 2009, I was in exactly the same position as you. I came to realize that people with grades like you and me are in high demand for very prestigious universities, etc. So someone who's gone through a similar environment, and then we test different variations. I won't go through all of them, but the letter, if it goes to the home or if it goes to the school, or which, and if it does it matter on gender or whatever. But the headline result, does it make an effect? Yes, it makes a big effect in terms of more applications, and more importantly, does it make a difference in terms of actual number of these kids who go on to university? I'll show you the effect size. There's a control group, and they're the ones who get the letter. I've just put them together in one letter. So it's quite a decent effect size, and you work out how much does it cost, not very much, compared to a bursary or some other kind of measure, to just give someone this extra cue, this encouragement to make a difference. Fine, nice to get going. What about some other effects? So this one we've been doing in schools. One of the key things that's happened in the educational system, some of you might know in recent years, is that if you fail your maths or English at 16, you're basically sent back to school, sent back to college. So our FE colleges are full of young people who actually kind of failed. They didn't enjoy maths and English last time, and hey, guess what you got to do, guys? Do it again. Again, a good illustration of it's quite hard to design a piece of legislation to say, hey, will you concentrate harder this time? But we've actually been doing trials to try and do something about this. So I'll just show you through a couple of them. Before I just go into, for those who haven't thought about this as a problem, the background to it is imagine you are discussing with your 15-year-old, end of the day, they come back in, how was your day at school? For those who've had that conversation, how was your day at school? Those who've got teenage kids? If you're lucky, you get an answer something like, fine. You have an articulate young person, otherwise you'll normally just get a grunt or something else. It's quite hard to engage in the young person's education. So the idea of this particular intervention was, could we mobilize support around the young person? So we asked them, it's a randomized controlled trial again, would you like to take part in this trial where you will nominate 2 people who we in the college will send them texts about what's going on in school, right? By the way, so the control group in this case, techie detail, given this audience, is the control group is not the people who said no. We take all the ones who say yes, and then we randomize them, and some of them get the text and some of them don't, right? So it's a true control. So what kind of text they get? They might get a text like this. Hi, Alice, check in with James, see if he's already started reading The Hunger Games. We'll discuss it in this book in GCSE English next week. In fact, sometimes people respond. So now, if you think about your 15-year-old, you can have a different kind of conversation. Say, so you're reading Hunger Games in class. Who's your favorite character? You have some information. Now, of course, you may get a response like, oh yeah, I do need to get started on that. But still, that's a significant step forward in terms of your ability to engage with your 15-year-old. Okay, so don't forget to read a few chapters before next week. It's still quite a light touch intervention. Does it make a difference? Well, we'll show you. So this is the impact on attendance. By the way, bear in mind, this is for FE colleges. FE colleges are paid for attendance. They have a financial incentive for people to turn up. This is the difference. So it's modest, but it's still significant, going from 63.5% to 66.5%. So it does make kids turn up more when they get these extra texts. The real question was, would it make a difference to their actual grade performance? So here we go. I should say, by the way, incredibly cost effective. So it's very, very cheap to do this. And in terms of even the return to the FE college, what they get paid for the extra bums on seat hopefully makes sense. What does it do to attainment? Well, you'll notice quite low attainment rates, partly because these are resets, but we're getting about a 6 percentage point increase, or just to put that in, as it were, marginal increase terms, that's a 27% increase in the pass rate, 6 percentage point. That's a big effect for sending a few extra texts. And I'll come back to this example later. So on the one hand, it's like, in fact, some of you might know, Today programme picked this up this morning, discussed again. Mainly, by the way, I was only there to say, as long as I had to say the word pro bono economics. That was the only reason why I was supposed to be on. But actually, it's an enormous effect for quite a cheap intervention. But it gives us a glimpse into what might be possible. In everyday speak, if you think of a teenager, there's a right or the wrong thing to say, and we often seem to get it wrong if we're parents, speaking for myself anyway. And it enables you to do this. So one of the things that's maybe attracted less attention is also a key issue for many young people who don't go on to succeed is a feeling of belonging, and particularly feeling belonging in a school or an educational context. If you feel like it's not a place for you, maybe Chris, you'll talk about this later, then that's actually a pretty big off-putting part of the story. So we've also been doing work in this area, and I just could show you 2 interventions in this space. So one is in the psychological literature, it's called values affirmation, or overcoming what we call stereotype threat, which boils down to you don't really feel like it's a place for you. And one of the challenges in this work is, can you find a way to make a young person realize they can be who they are, and that's compatible with being in school and learning maths, etc. So this is also done with 16, 17-year-olds. So what we ask them to do, this is done as a kind of online bit of work they have to do, and they kind of log on, takes about 20 minutes or whatever, and they're asked to do, first of all, just scribble down what are your personal values, think of things that are important to you. So they might click on this case, oh, being good at art or relationships with friends and families, right? In some extent, it doesn't matter. Just say what's important to you. And then they're asked to reflect on it in a slightly deeper way, which is to say, you want to write down a few words, basically, thinking about what are those values you picked. Think about some times when, these were important to you and something meaningful that you did, and write a few sentences about it. And you can see someone's written here on the back. For my sister's birthday last year, I spent a month doing a painting of her from some old family photos. I really enjoyed looking at the photos. Amazing how different we looked at them. She was really happy and she saw it and blah, blah, blah. What are we trying to do? I won't go through. There's a whole class of interventions. We're basically trying to make the young person feel good about themselves and who they are. And then as you go through the exercise, and that is compatible with the things that are going on in school, right? That's what it sort of boils down to. You feel more confident in yourself in everyday speak. Okay, does it make a difference? Well, let's have a look. I won't show you the it drives up attendance, but it's a similar kind of effect size, actually. A slightly different sample group, but so it's bringing you up to give you in kind of round numbers, sort of 25% increase or 4.2 percentage point effect size. Again, pretty chunky and respectable. Also, hopefully, it's actually making the kids feel better about themselves. And one of the interesting questions is it not only drive up their grade performance, one of the great hopes is that it's doing more than that in terms of what's the change which is occurring in the young person. I'll just show you another one, which is maybe less well known. So one of the big government flagship programs for young people, which was built partly for social mobility reasons, is National Citizen Service. Lots of reasons why it was done, but it goes to one of the key issues in mobility is to do with your social capital, your social networks. So you guys are all very well educated, you're here in the Royal Society and so on and so on. You'll have high trust, you have great social networks. That's an incredibly powerful asset in terms of your mobility, right? Most jobs are got through your networks, et cetera, et cetera. So it's really consequential. And for those who don't know the details of NCS, a key component is it has a residential component with young people, right? They go away and they're mixed deliberately. Social mixing occurs. And it's built overtly to create bridging social capital. So again, a really important detail is if you look at social capital variables in the UK, they are massively differentiated by social class. So if you go to university, basically, your social trust, your networks are far, far higher. It's a really big effect size. And one of the arguments is that you learn the habits of social trust when you go away to university, right, and in that particular environment. You mix up different people, they learn they can be trusted. So NCS has been running, but one of the questions is to do with the dropout rates. So for kids who sign up, and do it, we still have, look, 85% looks great, but as where the half empty is, 15% aren't turning up. They don't turn up for NCS, and it should be a quite powerful process. So we did this intervention, which is 4 weeks before, we basically introduced the young person to another young person. So they say, hey, Gus, can we introduce you to, Jane or whatever it will be, because she's also going to be doing the course, and you might want to exchange with each other. Of course, they rapidly just flip onto another platform, like Instagram or whatever. Does it make a difference if we do that? Well, yes, it almost halves, we should really put it the other way around if you think about it, it almost halves the dropout rate by doing that introduction before. It's really neat. I thought you'd love this extra detail. You might say, well, one of the ideas of NCS was let's also use financial incentives and say, hey, and if we both turn up, we get 50 quid to HMV or whatever. Well, great, let's do that as well. Actually, it does nothing. By the way, a really important detail, just touch on at least one example. Things that don't work, you really want to know, and particularly if they're going to be really expensive. So it turns out, don't spend what was going to be a really expensive element on the incentives, just do the buddying bit. But I just want to show you one twist, which we haven't published, which is, does it also matter who? Does it matter who we introduce you to, right? Who the young person is? So we actually did some further analysis, which we haven't put out, I just thought I'd show you today, which it turns out it does. So these are the interaction terms. You're geeky, so you know what I'm talking about. And in particular, let me just show you a couple of them. So if it's cross-matched by free school meal, a measure of sort of social class differential, or by, in this case, it's white versus non-white, it makes you significantly more likely, again, relative to average, to turn up, which is a beautiful result. So if we introduce the young person to someone who is different than them, they're even more likely to turn up to NCS, right? If you think about why that might be, because you're afraid it will be different kind of people, et cetera, et cetera. If the people who are different than you turn out to be not aliens and they're quite nice, they're even more likely to turn up. Interesting question is whether, for example, you can use it at the junction between primary and secondary to do introductions and reduce the fear and so on and so on. So anyway, I think pretty cool. I just thought I'd briefly mention at least some of the work which we're now doing, and others, of course, on machine learning. think one of the questions for all of us is, can we use this for good things as opposed to, just who you're going to date next or keeping you online to whatever, more advertising. And I'll show you one example. It's obviously controversial stuff, and how does it fit together with an account about experimentation, etc. So this is individual pathways through the care system in a piece of the UK, a local authority. Just give you a sense of the numbers that come through it. This is youth social work. Some of the kids we are most worrying about then. The kind of numbers you see, so in an area, 32,000 contacts, people saying we're worried about this kid, this family. About 1,500 get referred. And then you can see the key bits here. So some of them get referred, but quite a few are marked for NFA, no further action, right? But interestingly, if you then follow for the next 6 months, quite a lot of them actually return into the system, more than 1,500 or whatever, some of which are quite serious. So our puzzle or our challenge is, can we use some kind of better algorithm to figure out who are the kids who are going to come back into the system that we might be able to do something about before? So we basically built this. And one of the interesting questions in a field like this, people say, well, there's not much data in social work. It turns out there's loads of data, but a lot of it, of course, is unstructured data. In other words, it's text, it's words, etc. So we're building a machine learning model to see, can you do that prediction? And I'll just show you this, what kind of results you get. This is an ROC curve. Those who know about it. So, as it were, by chance, what's the proportion of NFAs, no further action cases you get predict? It's high risk. That's the dotted line. This is how well the different models are doing. So the black line is basically using kind of the standard numbers, et cetera, et cetera. The other two lines, maybe I won't go into the detail of the difference, are basically using the text to see if we can improve the prediction. And the answer is you can actually improve it quite dramatically. Or in this case, we sort of said to the area of the local authority, how many extra kids could you take? And they said, well, we've got the capacity maybe about, in fact, it turns about 6%. So how well would the model perform if it could predict 6% more in? And I'll show you what it can do. Geeky for a second. It basically gets about, you can see this is, sorry, now we've done it as 1,000 cases, right? It's done as 1,000 cases divided up to be clear about it. And you see it picks up about 52 of the 60 who are true positive. So these are kids who you've marked down for no further action, but they're going to come back into the system. The model is predicting it pretty well. And only 6 false positive. Now, it's true it's missing quite a few. These are false positive, false negatives, but it's getting about half of them on a 6% sample, right? So it's really quite a powerful tool that can be used. And of course, we think of it in a very different bucket from normal experimentation. But of course, machine learning is sort of doing experimentation in a blind way to test what is true, what's in this data, etc. So I think we should remember, and what's quite a controversial topic now, can we use this stuff for good as opposed to, well, whatever it's being used for? Leave it at that. So really I want to kind of draw it to a close now, but to say the bigger story here, it'd be nice to talk about lots of other examples around what else can you do on mobility, for instance, rainy day saving, essential life skills, or non-cognitive stuff which matters, and maybe leave that for another day. But the bigger story that sits behind it, particularly for this audience, is that it's a different approach of policy, right? In quite a profound way, using randomized controlled trials to actually figure out what might be effective, as opposed to what we've generally done for the last 1,000 years, which is to say, hey, I've got a great idea, let's do it everywhere. And the truth is we often don't know if it'll be effective, and we certainly don't know it in relation to variations. So this is, of course, manifest in relation to the What Works approach. I serve Minister's National Advisor on What Works. Can we generate better evidence? Can we put it in a form, translate it, transmit it to professionals who are making those decisions day in, day out, like head teachers and others? And of course, can we also, a key part of it is, even if we do that, does it get adopted? Does anyone listen anyway? I think education, my own view, is the standout success. It shows you what is possible in only 5, 6 years, actually 6 years now since EF has been around, the Educational Endowment Foundation. It's our What Works Centre. And it produces, many of you will know, toolkits and things that look like this. Look really simple. Some people complain it's too simple, But at a glance, you can see different kinds of interventions based on, scanning of the whole literature, but increasingly massive randomized controlled trials. So the Educational Endowment Foundation just passed 1 million kids in Britain who in the last 5 years have taken part in a randomized controlled trial. And the world didn't end. We haven't, really interestingly, we haven't had people protesting on the streets, maybe we will tomorrow, but that actually want to figure out what's effective. And you can see at a glance, well, 3 things. How effective is this kind of intervention in months, progress? How expensive is it over here, indicatively? And interestingly, importantly, how confident are we about this result? So you can see at a glance certain things like, in fact, a very popular one up there, aspiration interventions. A lot of aspiration interventions, the evidence is, don't work very well, actually. So you should go on and become a civil servant. You could become Gus O'Donnell one day if you really stick at this, guys. Turns out it doesn't really work, not because of Gus. Because actually a lot of kids do have high aspirations. They don't know how to translate it into action, right, in important ways. As opposed to certain forms of structured feedback, incredibly powerful. Although if you look up aspiration interventions, it's only got one padlock, so we're not really sure about that result. But to me, this is the real game changer, is to turn policy and practice, I hardly need to tell you guys, into something which is an empirical project, as opposed to, hey, seems like a good idea. So I just thought I'd return at the end to the new green book, actually, just being published, which is the Treasury Guide to How You Do Policy, which Gus will know. He's fought many years, in fact, he wrote one of the versions. But first major rewrite in 15 years. And one of the key changes in it is got this, it might seem a small detail, no one's picked up on the media, but it's actually fundamental. Instead of the idea you do all your policy appraisal, blah, 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 at the end, it might be a good idea to evaluate, instead do your policy where you build that in from the outset. In other words, you think about it, and ideally you don't even introduce one policy, you deliberately introduce variants so that you could actually, if you're from pro bono economics, say at the end, turn up and say, actually we can easily just put this into a regression and find out if it worked. The truth is, many of us in the room will know, a lot of evaluations are a waste of time because they have no contrast, there's actually no decent method. But if you design it in the beginning, it's relatively straightforward. So this is a key change. And actually, one of the things in the Green Book is referring to the evolution of that trial I showed you earlier around the study supporter. And actually, the EF are now supporting an expansion of it. If I just show you, one of the things, of course, is this doesn't end with just great study supporters, neat. Well, you want to now turn out, well, what other combinations? We'd already done a separate trial showing, well, if you send the text to the kids, that works pretty well. You want to start now testing combinations. Well, what happens if it's study supporter only versus send the text to the kids only versus sending it to both? Well, that's a good idea. It turns out that looks really, really promising. This is a small N, it's in 4 colleges or whatever, but on the face of it, that's a pretty big effect size in terms of increased pass rate, GCSE pass rate. It shouldn't stop. We should carry on doing it again and again and again, iterate, improving it. Well, what's the best message? These are the messages we thought. What's the best time of day? Should we send it in the morning, in the afternoon? There are endless questions like this which turn out to be really important in terms of marginal improvements that are possible. I should say a key thing is then to scale it. So with projects like this, I think we're working with 30-odd colleges. We have another 60-odd signed up for September. Still, that's a pretty good start. 24,000 schools in the UK. How do we get the rest of them? So if you're running a school and you think this is interesting, come and give us a call. So in conclusion, try and bring it to a head. I'm going to show you, actually, I think, in this room, people, a lot of you are here because you think this is pretty sensible stuff. In fact, it's kind of a no-brainer. Of course we should do it this way. A lot of the world doesn't think that, and we have to remind ourselves of that. This is a wonderful headline from that great source of knowledge about the world, the Daily Mail, which was from a couple of years ago, 2015. As we lift the lid on the government's nudge unit, time to stop these secret tests. Actually, I should, of course, there's a gratuitous opportunity to say, it turns out not that secret, which publish a lot of what we do. But there are concerns, there are rival views about, isn't it unfair to run tests? And we could be experimenting on our children. Well, how else are we actually going to find out what is marginally more effective, right? The other fascinating thing, why I particularly love this one, is that when this story, they put it out, the Daily Mail were also advertising for a behavioural scientist they were recruiting at the time. Why do they want a behavioural scientist? Well, folks, this is why. Obviously, Daily Mail are busy running experiments on us every single day with A/B formatting to figure out how can we capture your attention and get you through to click as many possible adverts. What is the optimum amount of cleavage that should be exposed in order to keep you on that page? Great minds are working on this. So it's not like it's not being used, and the question is, can we use it for good? The other thing which we have to remind ourselves, which is this kind of thing. So many good ideas don't work. Again, many of you will recognize what this is really about. This is actually, when I was writing inside the Nudge unit, actually, it was an Evening Standard story with this fantastic new idea which was being introduced in London, which was that school children would be, in North London, be taught lessons on life behind bars. Many of you might recognize this, it would be ringing bells. In the US, a very famous program called Scared Straight, which is a brilliant idea. It is a wonderful, nice idea. You take this young kid who's giving you trouble in your classroom, and we say, right, we're going to take you along. Turns out, in this case, the back of a Serco van rather than a police van. But And we'll take it along and it'll make it realistic. And this is where you're going to end up if you don't study in maths in class, right? You'll see some tough offenders and blah, blah, blah. Of course, it turns out, in fact, a year before this was being announced in London, there have been 2 systematic reviews. And an unusual example is really well studied. So our best estimate is that kids who you put through a program like this are roughly 60% more likely to go on and become offenders. So it's a brilliant idea. It just turns out it doesn't work. In fact, it's truly counterproductive. But the really terrifying thing about this, which again, pro bono, why it's so important, is that most areas of government policy, we have no idea. We have no idea if the program we're running or the billions we are spending are effective or even harmful, right? But we could do something about it. So, in conclusion, I hope the story will be, when we look back on this in this period, when we talk to our kids about it, whatever, it will be, yeah, there were some really cool nudge things, and we're now doing these things in our schools, and we worked out motivational text, and we worked out how to do essential life skills and build resilience and empathy and so on and so on. But probably the bigger lesson will be, obviously, we do randomized controlled trials, and we use discontinuity methods, and blah, blah. That's just what we do. That's just what professionals would do, and that's what policymakers will do. And I think that we will look back on it rather like we might look in relation to medieval medicine and just say, like, hey guys, what the hell did you used to do? What did you used to do? You had these weird models of human behavior, which were written by Gus when he was younger, which seemed to bear no resemblance to reality. And then you got these good ideas and you never test them and then you roll them out on whole populations. Like, what were you thinking? So I personally just, finally, pro bono economics, we've got changes in the Green Book. We've got things like the Trial Advisory Panel. We've got What Works Centres. We've even got crazy things like the Behavioural Insights team. It's not really mainstream, but there's quite a lot of it building. It is so important. It's so important that we can do this and actually help a wider population understand that this is normal and should make sense. So I'll leave it with that, and hopefully you also broadly think that might be possible too. Thank you all.
David, thank you very much. We'll now move on to the panel session, but I can't help, when you were going through that, I had an event in Parliament earlier this week with people talking about student mental health and about the number of programs that were at universities to help students with mental health. Vast numbers, and I asked about the evaluation and whether they tested. Virtually zero. And the psychiatrist, chief psychiatrist was there. He said, I'll tell you one thing. He said, a number of these programs are doing harm, a number of them are doing nothing, a number of them are doing a lot of good, but I haven't a clue which. And that's kind of scary. That's universities for you. Right, our panel today, on my left, Professor Sandra McNally, Professor of Economics, so we get the economics input, because, these social researchers. Professor of Economics, special interest in education, holds posts at both the LSE, where she directs Education and Skills Programme in the Centre for Economic Performance, and as well as the Director of the Centre for Vocational Educational Research at the LSE, and also holds a post at the University of Surrey. Actually has some time as well to do serious research on issues like reading at primary school. So we'll hear from Sandra first, and then from Chris Brown, who is the principal at Bridge Academy in Hackney, which is, for those of you who don't know about it, one of those great schools which is amongst the top 10% academies in the country, takes in kids with very difficult backgrounds and is doing a fantastic job. So we have 2 experts here. We will have a little discussion about what David said, and then I will come to you, the experts out there, and take questions from you and get your views from any members of the panel you want to. But Sandra, do you want to kick off? What do you think of what this crazy social research is saying?
Well, it sounds good to me, I think. I've been working in this area for many years, and when I started working in economics of education, it was like randomised controlled trials were done in the United States quite a lot, but it was never going to be done here because it wasn't fair. And it's great that one of your contributions over the years is that this is now no longer true, and RCTs are done a lot in England, and they seem to be acceptable. So that's great. That's a real victory. And I also think that some of the studies that you illustrated are really good, really well done, and really interesting results. this is supposed to be a debate, so therefore I'm going to challenge things as well, otherwise it'd be a bit boring. So I think RCTs are great because if they're well implemented and if there's a big enough sample, they give you the closest we can get to proof in social science that something actually works compared to if it doesn't work, and that is fantastic. But there are still issues. First of all, that sometimes things can fade out over time. So we need to know if there's a long-term effect or not. And also because the difficulty is sometimes in the real world, things don't just translate as they did in the randomised control trial. You try to put it up and do it in the best possible conditions, but then when you get out into the real world and you do it, well, it changes because you're not just doing it with volunteers anymore. With experiments, you have to have volunteers. Most of the time, it's hard to do experiments that people haven't selected themselves in, and that already makes them different from what other people are going to be like. And also the social context can matter too. We're not in the business of doing what medical science does. So the social circumstances in which things are done really matters to the effectiveness or not. And to give an example of something that, one of the most famous examples in economics of a randomized controlled trial is the Tennessee STAR experiment. This is when kids were randomized into small classes and big classes. And they found quite big effects. It did fade out, but it seems to have come back now that people are in the labor market. But on the strength of that, in California, it was decided that, well, these small classes are a great thing. So they started having small classes mandated in California. But the problem was that in order to facilitate this, they hired a lot of inexperienced teachers. Now, if you're going to sort of replace one good input with another input, you can cancel things out. So it's an example of where sometimes in the real world, things don't stay constant. So you have to be aware of what your counterfactual is. Then the difficulty is, I accept that the Behavioural Insights team have found really interesting examples about applications to university and also text messages to induce people's behaviour. But I can point to other randomised controlled trials on these things as well, and well published as well, just as well done as these, that find that those things are not true even in a randomised control context. So it's important that we just are very careful about extrapolating the results of one study or two studies to a much broader context, it seems to me. And then I suppose, finally, I would say sometimes a nudge isn't enough. And we will see, for example, one of the examples is the resits. People resitting maths and English. There's a pass rate of 30%. Now, David's experiment will certainly makes a difference to that, and that's a very good thing to know. But I hope that's not the big idea in this area for trying to improve resits. It matters that further education colleges have no money, and things are getting worse for them. And there are some things that randomized controlled trials can't evaluate, which is things like, does expenditure matter? Does actual expenditure to colleges and schools matter? And for those sorts of questions, we have to look at other methods in social science, because really, I think social scientists should always be asking the right questions, and that is the first thing. And only secondly, what's the right methodology to use?
Okay. David, anything that you want to come back on? Yeah?
Well, I've obviously agree, and there's big questions around replication, crisis in particular. And especially in the US, where you see Arnold Foundation and others, there's quite a few examples exactly as you described. Very promising practices taken to the field, then there's no effect. One of the things I think is very impressive about EEF, again, is a good example of, is that they are doing it right. Start off with a good period, then you do 30 schools, etc., and then you see, will it work in normal circumstances? I mean, similarly on the trial which we did on, which Gus will remember, we did a lot actually in job centres, but we start on one site, it was it was an enormous effect, but there were lots of questions, spillover effects, etc. So we moved to a step wedge, actually not a true RCT, in a region to see in a more normal context and a load of them, will it still work? And the answer is, well, it was a smaller effect size, but it was still highly significant. So I absolutely agree with that. But the only thing I would challenge a tiny bit is that I think even expenditure, you can look at margins. So quite often you introduce a big program, it's like, we'd like to give lots of money to everyone, but we actually don't have enough. you have some kind of criteria to give it more, well, at least gives you the opportunity for a a discontinuity design.
That's not randomised control trial.
It's not around. So,
Yeah.
and one of the things is there's more in the world than RCTs, absolutely. And one of our hopes, I spent quite a bit of time with senior, our future leaders in the civil service, etc., get them to understand at least 5 major methods. Just routinely know what an RCT is, a discontinuity design, before or after, blah blah blah. Because then, if you get the basics of it, you can just literally build it into your policy and your ongoing practice, not as an exceptional thing, but normal. And then I feel like we'll really be getting there. My view when I do this sort of sessions, I often start with the most important first step is actually not the method, the complexity, which actually a lot of people find a bit scary, again, not in this room, but it's a more fundamental one, which is humility, is to know that we're often overconfident in our beliefs about programs working, and you should start from that point of view, well, what happens if I'm wrong? Or what are all the other choices that I wasn't able to explore? So I think if we can get that imbued into the system, hopefully along with there's more than RCTs, then we've got hope in hell of actually really starting to build a decent evidence base.
Okay. So Chris, I mean, classic example, school, not the biggest sample size in the world. How do you kind of use this sort of stuff? How do you know what works and what doesn't?
Well, I mean, that really is the question. I mean, I think just sort of to skip back one point, I mean, I just in case anybody is wondering how important it is to get this sort of thing right, Dr. Halpern mentioned earlier about the Serco van, and that's part of a project called Prison Me No Way. And I have worked in 4 secondary schools, 2 primaries, 4 secondaries. Of those 4, 2 of them have done Prison Me No Way. One as recently as 2015. So given that it has such a negative impact on our young people, clearly it is essential that we start to get this kind of data out to school leaders. In general in schools, I mean, I think what's really interesting about this is it is just so important for schools to adopt a learning mindset. And that fundamentally for me, that's for 2 reasons. One is because schools are places of learning. And so we should model learning. We should practice what we preach. And the other, of course, is that the reason I got into education is because young people have incredible potential and they deserve the very, very best. And if we're going to give them the best, then we have to know what works. But I would sound a note of caution, and this is very much to your point, Gus, about how do we know what works. I mean, one of the studies you talked about with the EEF was the feedback study. Now, feedback has, I think it's plus 8 months, isn't it? And so it apparently has this remarkable, it has this remarkable positive effect size. What it also has is the largest variation, I think I'm right in this answer, between positive and negative effects. And so basically what it's saying is if you get feedback wrong, it will go very, very wrong. And what we know in education is that we have got some things like this very wrong in the past. So I'm thinking of AFL, for example, so that's me being very nerdy as an educationist, so assessment for learning and a Holden and William approach to education and what you might call responsive teaching, which as a profession we did very, very badly, and not just missed an opportunity, but actively did some quite negative things. So I think for me it's about a mindset. It's about never, as a school, just adopting these things as off-the-shelf strategies, but always asking that question, always asking the question about how do I know that this is working, not just taking it as read. And there are so many different possible ways that we can look at that. I mean, it really depends on the particular area that you're looking in. But the key thing is to always keep your eye very, very focused on, is this actually working, or am I just doing it because I've heard that it is the right thing to do?
And because intrigued as a parent, when you're doing one of these tests and trying something out, do you tell the parents that's what you're doing, and do you tell the students that's what you're doing, and other teachers, have you ever done these things sort of covertly?
So we're doing one at the moment. Actually, we're doing the maths homework one, and so that's about texting the parents. And I mean, there's really no way not to tell the parents because they're receiving text messages. Yep. I mean, so It really does depend on the context. We've also done one very recently, which is around attendance and particular ways of addressing attendance and using your findings about using the number of days as opposed to percentages. There, because of the nature of what we were doing, we weren't saying to the parents, we're trying a randomised control trial. Well, I'm not sure what it is in RCT really. I mean, I'm not an expert in that at all. We weren't quite as open with the parents because actually, really, what we were doing was just trying to find something else that worked. So it depends on the context, but our general rule of thumb is to be absolutely as open as possible. And I would say as soon as we adopt something as policy, something we're going to be doing moving forward, we will always inform the parents of the change. And if it is backed up because we've done it through trial and various different things, we will explain that we've made the change because we've seen the improvements that it's caused.
Brilliant. Right. Now, you've been very patient sitting there. I'm very happy to take questions from the audience to any of our panel. Please it'd be great if you could say who you are and who the question is aimed for. And please do not be shy. I am applying, I'm afraid, the economist test to this. Does anyone in the room know the answer to the economist test? No?
Oh, you only because Gus told me.
So the economist test, they did some research. Obviously, they reported in the magazine about question and answer sessions and the gender diversity of people asking questions. And it was massively improved if the first question was asked by a woman. So sorry, sir, it's not that I didn't see you. It's just that you fail the economist test. So I'm waiting for the first question from the audience that passes the test. Yes, Julia. This is slightly cheating since Julia is the Chief Executive of Pro Bono Economics.
I'm claiming privilege here. Can I just throw out a challenge to the panel about whether and how you might track the evidence around inspirational teaching? Because I think every one of us in this room can record a time in our school lives where a teacher really shone a light on a subject and changed the way we thought about it. And I guess the easy answer is, well, it's priceless. But actually, if you could put a proper value on it, that would be really, really significant. So how could we do that, and what's been done already?
Go on, David.
I think one of the methods is actually sometimes underutilised is to, just a quick off the top of my head answer, but really is that you look at the distribution of performance in a population and then you try and then dig in great detail to figure out. So if some teachers seem to be able to do remarkably well with a similar population or a little bit better, then you almost have to marry it with a kind of ethnography to figure out, are they doing something else which is effective? Because that only gives you a hypothesis. Then the trick is really to then say, can we then take that insight with another teaching population and say, why don't you try the following techniques and see if it works better? So for example, there's one nice example, I think it was done with KIPP schools. It's not quite inspirational, but they looked at what drives in the US performance of schools, if I remember correctly, and then one of the things that was found was very strongly associated with how long the head teacher stays in place. And then you try and figure out what do the head teachers do who stay in place for longer. It turns out they do things like, which you probably recognise, that they are really good at the end of the day when they go home, just, okay, that's it. I'm going to think about my home now, right? So they manage to switch off. They're really good at delegating. They do these kind of things. But the real test is then they then use those techniques. You try and take some deputies. You try and teach them those techniques, and hey presto, they do then stay in place for longer. So it is possible, in principle, even with something as seemingly, magical as those kind of things, it might be possible to work out what it is, the active ingredient, and then can we help others?
Yeah.
Chris, you must, yeah.
Yeah, I think I would say really a very similar thing actually about sort of individual teachers as opposed to head teachers, which is that there is something about certain teachers which, if you could bottle it and sell it, I'd be very rich. And that can be incredibly hard to define. And sometimes it seems very context specific as well. A particular teacher for a particular student will be a remarkable inspiration, but maybe they won't be for other students. But there are some teachers in Bridge who constantly are utterly inspirational for the students. And it seems to be really hard to nail down exactly why that is. But what you can do is you can find a set of things, a typicality of behaviours that successful teachers do, And you can work with all your staff body to ensure that they all do those, to essentially raise the floor standard. So again, exactly what Dr. Halpern said about it, not necessarily being inspirational, but you can certainly find a group of things. I mean, there are some fantastic books written on this. I mean, there's the Teach Like a Champion is the one. I don't know if that's tip schools or... I think, for me anyway, that's the closest I've seen us manage to get. But there does seem to be a layer on top of that kind of highly effective teacher who does all the basics absolutely right all of the time. There's a layer on top of that which is genuine inspiration. But then I think that's actually probably true if you think in kind of any walk of life. I mean, I'm an ex-musician, and that was true of musicians as well. You know, there would be people who were technically very, very sound and played wonderfully, and then there were people you just always wanted to listen to. And you could never quite figure out why, but you always wanted to hear them. So...
So the Eric Clapton of the teachers, yeah. It's,
I mean, yes, the people you always wanted to listen to.
Very ageist. Oh, God. But it's true. I was just thinking about Pat Howes, who was my maths teacher at, I was at school in Battersea, and he was inspirational. And and I was trying to think why, and he just made a very complicated subject that every other teacher trying to teach me maths had made it seem even more complicated, really simple. And it made a huge difference. Anyway, anything?
Oh, well, I mean, just to say, there's lots of work in economics that shows you matches teachers up with students and looks to see what happens to their performance and measures the value added of the teacher. And it's one of the few things economics of education economists actually agree on, is that teachers really matter a lot to people's performance. But why they matter, it doesn't seem to be correlated with many observable characteristics. And I suppose one of the difficulties with inspiration is it's quite a difficult thing to measure exactly what you mean by that. So if you had particular training programs that were piloted that made people inspirational, then it would be not difficult to trial those things.
Yeah, could I just very quickly add slightly to that? You mentioned value added, and so one thing I would say is that our inspirational teachers, the ones I'm talking about right up there, the ones where students, when they come back from university, say, I chose this subject because of this teacher, they're always in our top group for value added. But not everyone in our top group for value added are the teachers that the students would describe as inspirational, but they do get the grades. So there is something in there which is a little bit nebulous and intangible.
Right, it's a gentleman at the back who I denied the first question to. So put your hand up, please, and there you go. The mic is coming.
Thanks very much. Henry Lusengor, DEFRA. My question is that behavioural economics and behavioural science are often characterised as an increasing long list of systemic anomalies to a sort of dominant theory of behaviour, that of economic rationality. I wonder, do you think that's a fair characterisation? And if it is it time that behavioural economics, behavioural science got its own theory of rationality, of what it was to be rational? And maybe that would help with people understand what you're trying to say, rather than just having lots of particular studies.
I could answer that. Oh, no. Am I allowed to as chairman? So, yeah, the question is, as David pointed out when I was teaching, do you explain to people that when you propose to someone, you say, would you like to maximise our joint utility function discounted over the future lifetime, or not? As opposed to, would you marry me? I mean, so... I think the model that I taught, I always use this example. Actually, the economic neoclassical perfect rational expectation, all that, works perfectly for a world of humans, for a world of robots, sorry. The problem with humans is they do make mistakes, they are inconsistent, there are all these other things. And so I think what economists kind of tend to do then is say, right, let's build all that in. So, you know, agent-based models and all the rest of it, we have various descriptions of how human behaviour is, and we're kind of working on what does that do. And the answer is it's very messy quite often, because if you've got very heterogeneous populations of people with very different characteristics, you lose some of the simplicity of the models. However, there are plenty of things that, like Ricardo's law of comparative advantage, for example, which I'm sure you will be using in your analysis of the Brexit. I had to get that word in tonight, because if I go a day without Brexit, I feel lost, on ag and fish. But I think So as economists, we did start off with a behavioural model that really didn't bear scrutiny. But David, you
Yes,
did
very short
let
one,
you
sir.
go first, and then professional economist.
Look, there is a beautiful elegance to a lot of economics, and it does work in quite a few domains. Let's not throw the whole thing out. But I mean, what it basically boils down to, in its core, is that humans are using a series of mental shortcuts or heuristics in order to make decisions, which approximate to, often in fact quite effective in the real world, but they have significant margins of error. What is messy about it is that there's not one. There are a whole pile of different heuristics. Even the simple judgment, like how far away is this can, we're using at least 3 or 4 or 5 different systems to make that estimate, right? And we can throw some of them. That's the problem, is our brain is using multiple systems. It does make for a messier theory. I think there's no doubt about that, but it does make it more realistic. But I know, topical example for DEFRA today, right? We got the big announcement around recycling, actually. But one of the things that makes it effective is that the non-linearity around prices. So that moving from 0 to 5p has this completely disproportionate effect because of endowment effects and so on and so on. So it does make our models more complicated, but it doesn't mean we can never use the simpler one, but we should always be trying to strive for what is the simplest model, which is nonetheless accurate. In the same way in physics, Newtonian moved to quantum. In many areas, Newtonian still just works just fine, but in some areas it really comes apart quite badly. We need to know what those areas are where our models are failing, and we need to do something better.
And the one thing I would add is, David mentioned the word humility. So if you think you know the way the mind's operating, there's a book that's about to come out from Nick Chater, who is on David's behavioural advisory panel, called The Mind is Flat, which actually tends to throw out quite a lot of the things that I thought we knew about the way the mind worked. And so we are learning quite a lot about these things. Right, ma'am, yes.
Thank you. Hi, my name's Rachel. I'm a trainee clinical psychologist. I currently work in Tower Hamlets Disabled Children's Outreach Team and have worked in various secondary mental health care teams across London. And I suppose when you're working clinically, you can't help but be immersed in the social determinants of distress. They're sometimes all that really is the cause. So all of this just leaves me wondering, how can nudges really be used to generate the structural inequalities that we know, and we have huge amounts of evidence to suggest causes mental health difficulties?
David.
Well, it actually goes, I'm glad it can come as a fundamental question. And Sandra raised it really earlier also around, well, how far what can you do with a nudge versus that? In fact, even though we've been, given the popular title Nudge Unit, in contrast, I think, actually to the approach pursued in the White House in the US, we're actually doing something slightly different, which is trying to introduce a realistic model of human behaviour. The easy ones to present in a few moments are a nudge. Hey, we just sent this text that has a big difference, But the question is, how do they build up into something larger? And sometimes you're trying to you need to put it alongside a systemic account. So, a good one which would be, we did lots of micro trials on eating behaviour. Can you cue someone to take a healthier choice? But actually, one of the things it tells you is people are incredibly inattentive to what they eat in lots of areas. So it becomes, when you look at the wider landscape, essentially, on behavioural principles, it takes you back to a very particular design for a sugar tax. And what's driving? That's actually driving, on the basis of a small number of marginal consumers moving, mass reformulation, absolutely mass reformulations occurring in drinks. Now, on mental health, obviously got some of those characteristics to come back, Are there things that you can do? We've got cognitive behavioural therapy at the level of the individual to have kind of more effective interventions. But the bit where it gets really interesting is to follow the etiology, right? Follow where's the variance. For example, would be if your boss is an arsehole, in non-technical speech, it's really big impacts on you. Gus will know from the life satisfaction literature, a 1-point movement on a 10-point scale of how you rate your boss is equivalent to a 30% movement in your income, right? Huge effect sizes. Well, doing any amount of CBT isn't going to fix that potentially. It'll just help you maybe resist it a bit. So a real causal intervention is going to intervene on those sides as well. Or in relation to social media would be a really interesting topical example. If the character of the way in which we're talking to each other on social media is particularly negative, it's problematic. Or even on Gus' example about the follow-through to the question, will you marry me, is will the marriage survive It's very well predicted by ratio of positive and negative comments made by people. You can pick apart all those elements, and it gives you a much wider landscape within which to potentially intervene. I guess you might not get in people's marriages, but in order to try and address mental health. So for us, actually, even though the topical way of expressing it is nudge, simple cue, the real story is not that. The real story is, can we understand really how human beings are functioning, including pursuing the wider etiology? And I think it still takes you sometimes to some quite novel, powerful solutions.
And there is something I should add. So I chaired a base with all the different medical groups. And actually I had a meeting earlier this week with the anaesthetists about evidence and about how they determine the use of evidence in working out what works clinically. And the honest answer is we are even in those areas in the infancy. So there are lots of, as I was talking about these university programs, lots of counselling programs. There's not been any real work on whether these make any difference to students' mental health or not. So there's a lot of guesswork going on. And I think the one thing I'd say, if Richard Laub would here, he'd require me to say, is that IAPT is the one thing that's actually done some proper evaluations. It may not be the answer for everything, but it is at least, you can start to ask the questions of it. I know you're not a complete convert by your body language, but it would be perfect. You could have a proper conversation about why you disagree with it, because there's actually data to look at it. Right, sir. And then I'll go to the back next.
My name is Henry Knappman. I work at UBS. I'm also governor of the Bridge Academy, where Chris is our principal. I've got two questions, if I may. The first one's to David and Sandra, which is about the decreasing marginal returns to nudging. Do you see evidence that after people have been getting that text message for a year or so, that the efficacy of it deteriorates? And a question to Chris. I know that the Bridge Academy has a good success rate in getting kids to what David described as competitive universities. And I was wondering if you could describe some of the techniques that you have adopted at the Bridge in order to generate that outcome.
So, David, do you want to?
Okay, on the first one,
yeah.
look, it depends. It seems to be the answer. The truth is, we often can't answer it because these things haven't been running long enough. We have examples of both. We have examples where we see fade out. We particularly tend to see fade out of these kind of the classic nudge type things, where you're trying to get someone to do something they didn't really want to do anyway, and they kind of get wise to it and they relearn. But where it's something you're trying to encourage, one way you might think about it is you're actually kind of creating what you might think of as behavioural scaffolding, which help get you into a different habit or a different way of being. This is both true if it starts to move your own behaviour, and especially if it starts to move the behaviour of those around you that reinforces it. So there are examples where the effects actually amplify over time, which is really interesting. So maybe I'll just leave that hanging.
Sandra. Yeah.
I agree that a lot of these things don't run for long enough to know what the long-term effects actually are. The example I was thinking of where a text message program didn't work was a study published by Roland Fryer, and it was sending text messages to kids in school about the relationship between how hard they work and labour market earnings. And actually it did increase their effort in school, but it didn't increase their actual educational achievement. And one of his hypotheses about why this was the case was because the kids didn't know how to study effectively. They didn't know the best way to increase their achievement. And that's a case where I would say, well, a nudge might help, but it isn't going to get you to the outcome that you want, so it isn't enough on its own.
Chris?
To Henry's
To the boss's question.
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of on being the boss, actually, just very briefly to the comment about people's mental health and your boss being a difficult individual. No, but I mean, it's one of the most humbling things I've heard in a long time. I mean, I have over 200 members of staff and over 1,100 students that I take care of, that I'm in charge of. And I mean, I just didn't know that. And there's something there about the importance of this information being widely disseminated, isn't there? I mean,
it's one of those, when you do the time use stuff, it's actually one of Danny Kahneman's favourites is the thing that people hate most is being in the same room as their boss. Now, there could be some correlation that when they're in the room, it's because the boss is telling them off. But it does say something about what bosses bring people into the room for. That it's not for praise, it's for...
And is that specifically when the boss brings people into the room, or if you go into their room?
No, this is
it's a day reconstruction method. So we ask, what are you doing and how
what are you
happy
doing? And it's when I'm with my boss, it's really negative. One of the other big negatives is commuting, and afterwards we can talk about other physical activities. And
so we'll aim to make line management more interesting than commuting. Good. To Henry's point, we have had quite a lot of success recently at Bridge with university applications. We had 91% of our students from year 13 last year went to universities, and 70% of them were the first in their families to do so, and we were incredibly proud of that. We had previously had a little bit of I'm not going to say problem, concern, which was that we were bumping along at around about 10% of students going to Russell Group universities. Now, we're a totally inclusive mixed ability sixth form, so 10% is probably about right, but we wanted to do better than that. And also, when we disaggregated the data, we noticed something interesting and very troubling, which was that if you just looked at the free school meal students, and that's over half of our sixth form, that it was nowhere near 10%. It was absolutely nowhere near 10%. And then if you looked at those free school meal students who could have gone, who got offers, who got the grades, and who didn't go, it was an astonishingly high number. And the number of them who said to our careers advisor, yeah, I'm not going to go there because the course is better at this university. I don't know if you actually remember this conversation from governance, Henry. The course is better at this university, this non-Russell Group university. It was really, really significant. And the free school meals was really the thing that did it. There were certain things for ethnicity as well, but fundamentally free school meals was the point there. And what we decided was we have to get to the bottom of this. We have to find out if it's actually the case that these students have done incredibly good research and have decided, made the right decision about the right course, or if there's something else going on. And actually we did a lot of the things that you were talking about. I mean, we worked closely with Future First, which meant that we were able to bring back alumni that we had from high-performing and Russell Group universities and get them to talk to our sixth form. When we did visits to university, we would, if there was a student there who'd previously been at Bridge, we'd have that student lead the tour. We did everything we could to normalise university. We were in a very fortunate position of being able to get mentors from UBS, who were people who are about 23, 24, just come out of university, to come in and talk to our students about university and about not being worried about student debt and things like that. But I think, by far the one that seemed to have had the biggest impact was kids coming back and speaking at assemblies. And I think that really speaks to your point about the letter. And so, I mean, it's made a huge difference to us. So we've doubled our Russell Group percentage. So we're at 20% Russell Group. That was last year as well, actually. It should be higher this year. And the big change is amongst the free school meals students. And we've also we had 4 offers from Cambridge this year and 1 Fulbright scholarship. And 60%, so 3 of those 5 kids were free school meals kids. So, I mean, I'm no expert in random control trials, and that is a small sample. But in terms of me trying to figure out what's working at my school, we adopted some of the key principles that we'd heard about, and it does seem to have had an immediate and very, very positive impact.
I think, just picking up on that, I know it's a bit of a joke, but it's a serious point that quite often we work with very small charities, and the last thing we're telling them to do is randomised control trials because the sample sizes are just too small. Right, yeah. So, now, as a man there I recognise, John, could we get the mic there? And I think we should try and take 2 or 3 questions this time because we'll try and get through as many as we can. Yes, woman at the back there, and then gentleman at the front here. Fire away.
John Bird, I'm in the House of Lords to dismantle poverty, founder of The Big Issue. Is nudge, in a sense, are nudges in a sense more about prevention, as you mentioned, than simply with coping? I'm not quite getting it. Sorry about this. I feel in a way maybe nudges are a replacement for a complete overhaul of the whole system of how we gather knowledge and how we run our education system. So to me, it's beginning to sound in some ways almost like a coping mechanism for failures. It's like continuously trying to avoid the fact that in the kind of class system that we have, we are producing people who are predicted to fail because of where they come from, because of the kind of education, because of the kind of social condition, the fact that you produce people who are going to be the 0 hours workers of 10 years or 20 years' time, if there are still any of those kind of jobs around. And is Nudge, in a sense, avoiding that? I'm sorry to ask such a primitive question, because I've sat here largely concerned and confused. Thank you.
Good. We like concerned and confused. There's yes at the back there. We'll take 2 or 3 and then together. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Claire Hughes. I work at the Department for Education on higher education policy. I'm just thinking it was really interesting to hear about kind of what you've been doing at the Bridge Academy with students there. But I'm thinking more of kind of maybe the Doncaster area, where participation to higher education is very low, particularly among disadvantaged students, and there actually might not be that many alumni to come back and talk to students and those kind of resources for people who are like me, which is obviously so effective. Can you give any recommendations or tips on how maybe simple nudge things, or if there's RCTs coming up, that would help those kind of people when they don't have those kind of resources?
Thank you. Yeah, there's a gentleman at the front who's had his hand up a long time. Up here. Mic up here, please. And a lady there.
Thank you. Kent here. So before I ask this question, I'd better say I think this is good things that you're doing, because this might sound a little bit cynical now. What the Nudge unit is doing is that you're basically getting into our brains with behavioral economics and behavioral stuff. So did Cambridge Analytica. And we can all see major differences here, but now we're putting this weapon, or method rather, in the hands of the government. And I seem to remember there was this fellow Orwell that wrote about this a long time ago. So how should we be thinking about this in the hands of the government? Should there be some limits to this? And how do we set them, and how do we think about it?
Okay. So, David, you want to kick off?
Sure. Then come back. I think it's such a... Actually, I'll just deal with that one straight away. So, look, I mean, our view is, certainly my view, is that behavioural science is actually like any other form of knowledge. You can use it and you can abuse it. If I was just talking to someone earlier about this in relation to, you can use biochem to build nerve agents, or you can build medicines with it. And it has got absolutely those characteristics. In fact, one reason why governments across the world are drawn into this area is, in fact, to regulate the extent to which, because you are being nudged and manipulated all the time by advertisers and many others, and it turns out more people than you thought you were in relation to your social media. For BIT, I think it's, myself, really important. Gus will know, but governance is quite tough in terms of even though it's a social purpose company, it's co-owned by Cabinet Office still, and so on and so on. And actually, it's important and appropriate that we can come up with some interesting ideas, and someone else other than us says, actually, that's not okay, we don't like that. And even trials themselves, I always think one of the things about a trial, not only is it a test of effectiveness, it's actually a test of acceptability. And we have had some trials which we've ceased because we've got feedback from people like, what are you doing, etc. I personally think, and I do differ a bit from my colleagues in the US about this, which is in a number of areas, including your example, or indeed social media, I personally think mechanisms are nowhere near strong enough where the public set the parameters. So I'm a big believer in the use of deliberative forums, where you take samples of the public and you show them the evidence and you say, what do you think? So concretely, I personally think one of the ways we're able to maintain the line on changing the default on pensions, which you might think is one of those things, hugely effective, was because Adea had done an incredibly comprehensive, essentially public consultation showing the evidence, and the public kind of gave government permission then to make that rather important nudge or change. That's not true. Big social media, for example, they like to talk about the community all the time. It's not clear they've got a mechanism where that community has any meaningful voice apart from as expressed by what you click through, which, as we know, is a rather odd measure of your utility. On the point about the wider one, which is going to come up a few times, and I wish we had more time on it, about nudge versus complete overhaul. So, I mean, I should say I do think there's rather a strong defence for what you might call rather, humbly, marginal gains, marginal improvements, etc. Lots of people in the room have made that similar argument. Not to be sniffed at. I mean, medicine makes major advantage, for most part, through what look like small improvements, small steps. But in many areas, it does take you to more fundamental critiques, and we haven't got time to go through them all. But in relation to social mobility, just a quick couple of examples. In our views, there's quite big issues in relation to people on low income seem to make sometimes strange decisions because their minds are so busy on worrying about money, they have tunneling effects, etc. A key response to us is we should do much more in relation to rainy day savings. We should encourage or make possible far more people on low incomes to have small pots of money. It has quite a big impact. I mentioned in passing the stuff in relation to essential life skills. How do you nurture, this determination, perseverance, empathy, ability, which we think mediate a lot of the effects of social class differentials, even before someone enters a school, and those are quite big ongoing projects. They are definitely a lot more than a nudge, but they are nonetheless using some deep insights on behavioural insight. By the way, I think you came in and gave one of our, it's legendary, you came and gave a seminar with us in Treasury, I remember. In fact, I remember you thumped me really hard. I can't remember why, for some effect, because so maybe that was it. But it was a matter of much amusement, which continues to this day. Anyway, thank you.
Would I be able to just pick up quickly the point, the education comment? So, I think it has hopefully come across this evening. I'm a really big fan of the nudge work, and we try and use it wherever possible at Bridge, at whatever scale and whatever level of accuracy, and it's really helped shape our thinking and change our thinking. So I really do admire the work that's gone on. Equally, I wouldn't really want anybody to leave here this evening believing that nudging on its own will be the thing that fixes some of the problems in the education system. I think that there are some very significant issues with funding, for example, that the nudging really helps us to address, but it's a sticking plaster. I don't know if that was your phrase, but it sticks in my mind a bit. And I think there are certain things in our education where actually a paradigm shift in thinking is required. So the nudge stuff helps us to be always focused on our impact, always focused on what works, and that's really important. But to your point, absolutely, people shouldn't leave here thinking that it is the be-all and end-all for education, anyway.
Yeah, a few points to raise in relation to comments raised there. I think it's important we do evidence-based policy as opposed to thinking that, just nudge. I think it depends on the question that you're asking as to what sort of methodology or way of thinking is most appropriate. And I think we talked about humility, but I think researchers need to have humility too about what are the limits about what we can say based on current research, and never giving the impression that we somehow, even with our randomised control trials, can tell you the answer, or you can just look it up on the website, that somehow it's a simple matter to figure things out. On the question about Doncaster, there is lots of work on information type interventions. They don't all work. I have done a review for ISA World of Labour exactly on that subject. But what seems to matter a lot is careful targeting of people and appropriate interventions for where people are. There's no good trying to get people to apply to Russell Group universities if they don't have the right credentials up to them. They have to have the exam results, otherwise there's no point. And then on the unfortunate thing about Cambridge Analytica for those of us actually doing research is that, it is so difficult to get data from administrative data from the government. It takes ages. It feels like people are very fearful about giving good researchers and good institutions the data, and they take a long time to do it. We have the Data Protection Act. For most of the time, the people using these confidential data sets are incredibly well monitored, that we're jumping through a whole lot of hoops to get the data. And I would like Britain to be a country that was less fearful about giving data to reputable people with the appropriate safeguards in place, because this is an area where other countries are far better.
And I have to say, it's an area where we're going backwards. I've got my Institute of Fiscal Studies hat on for that statement, and Paul Johnson, if he were here, would really echo that. There's a problem. There's a lady there, yes? And then gentleman there, yes. Sorry.
Thank you. I mean, my question is really around how you get evidence-based research to be used in schools. So medicine's gone through that process, agriculture's gone through that process, but decision-making in schools is still tends to be based on word of mouth, on instinct, leadership instincts. And government policy in the States and in the UK here is very clearly to try and get evidence-based research into schools. And the EEF's a great, great initiative there. But I work for a not-for-profit organisation called Success for All. It is a teaching and learning programme for primary schools. It has over 40 years of randomised controlled trials coming from the States. It's very, very reproducible. It has the highest rate of rating on the EEF and the Evidence for Impact websites. And so, yes, I know that actually it's very difficult to get schools to use evidence-based and to use the EEF website for their decision-making. And both in the States and the UK, the nudge for schools seems to be just funding. So we've got the Strategic School Initiative Fund here, and that's the only incentive for schools to actually use evidence-based programs because the funding is dependent on that program. So how do you nudge schools to start using that evidence base?
Okay, thank you. Yes. Can we get the mic along to you over there?
Peter Sinclair, economist from Birmingham.
Indeed.
I'd just like to ask, people do silly things that hurt themselves, and people can do silly things that hurt other people. And I'd like to know whether Nudge has more success in dealing with that, the first problem, or with the second. And following that, can I just ask, do we know from evidence whether nudging is an alternative to taxing or subsidizing or regulation, or is it complementary with them?
Okay, good questions. Yes, yes. There.
Jenny Bates from Bayes, member of the GES. I'd like to ask you a bit of a question about gender and nudging. There's a sort of growing and quite lively debate in the economics profession about the role of gender in economics and the extent to which there's some evidence that female economists approach issues differently from male economists. And with that in mind, I'm sort of interested in whether nudge approaches and techniques have actually been used to look particularly at the gender differences in populations, but also whether we could be using it more to think about different groups in the UK, particularly gender issues and the design of policy.
Okay, since this will be the last round of questions, one at the back there. We'll take two more, and then you'll have to grab them afterwards to get more. One there and one there. Yes. Far away at the back first.
A simple question. What is the point of evidence if, well, we look at Prison Me No Way and we see it as actually having a negative impact, yet they're still around, they're still selling? Are we just waiting for people to vote with their money, or should there be a harsh action if it's actually proven to have a negative impact?
Okay, that's good. Yes.
Yeah, hello. Paul Dinsdale, Health and Social Affairs writer. I was just going to ask David about the evidence for the nudge approach in public health and how far the state should intervene in creating so-called healthy behaviour, or whether people should be left to make their own independent decisions. And just to throw in one example about public health in Scotland, where they introduced minimum pricing for alcohol, I think there's some evidence now that it hasn't really affected the consumption of alcohol, but money's been taken away from household budgets, which might be spent on food for the family and so forth. Just be interested in his comments on that.
Right, whole series of things. Who'd like to go first? Yes, Chris.
There's the one about schools, which I thought was a really interesting question. So I think there are a few things, actually, that are barriers to schools being able to use, well, to wanting to use evidence. And I feel I'm in a very privileged position in lots of ways with Bridge. So I think that there's accountability on schools is very, very harsh. So if things, and in sort of a direct sense and also in a slightly indirect sense. And so the level of risk that a head might feel they were taking, if they're going to change the way that they do things, they may perceive that risk as being really quite high. Now, if they have something which fundamentally has been working okay, well enough for quite a while, they are, I would suggest, unlikely to want to take that risk. So I think that there's something there. I'm not saying that this is correct. I'm sort of so to sort of if we're looking for ways that we might want to approach this, if we can pick out some of the problems that might help us. This is linked. There's something around time. So there is a relatively often, and I speak as someone who's worked in a number of turnarounds. There's a lot of pressure to get it done fast, and by fast I mean really you have to turn around your first set of results in a year. And if you're going to turn around your first set of results in a year, there's a set of things you are going to do to get that sorted. Again, actually, and the feedback point that I was talking about earlier really makes this point. If you're going to get this right, as a school leader, you need to engage fully in the evidence. You need to really understand it. And that takes time. There's just no way out of it. Something like the feedback, you have to get right in your own context, because context is king with these things. And that will mean that some of it will go right and some of it will go wrong. And it's an iterative process, and you have to get there using, of course, the toolkit as your guide. But that is a time-consuming process, and that won't give you the immediate impact that perhaps you need. Although longer term, it's definitely a better idea. And I think the final thing I would say on it is that culture eats strategy for breakfast. I mean, as a school leader, I really genuinely believe that. So if you haven't got the culture in your school right, and I mean culture in the widest sense, whatever of these things you do, they might have marginal impacts, but they're not going to make for great big changes. And so really, you need to be able to lay the foundations to build on by getting that culture in place really, really soundly. Otherwise, what you'll see is massive variation between classrooms, because in some classrooms, the culture will be there, because I have teachers who can get that, and in some classrooms, it won't. And so you won't be able to pick out the things that are working cross-school, because actually other factors are creating so much noise that it's impossible to track what's successful. So I hope that's not too negative, because actually if you could look at those three things and start to think about how to solve them, or if you're fortunate enough to find yourself in a position like I do where they're less of an issue because results are good and so on, then that's where you can start to engage with this evidence. And of course then you can see the positive impact of that, and that's a virtuous circle.
Sandra, do you want to have a go at some of those?
On the first question about why do schools not use evidence-based policy, well, I'm not convinced that they don't, but I don't think you should look up the EF website, look at a list of their things, and then just unthinkingly adopt them in your school. I think it's an input to decision making, but not the only input. So you also have to think about, what your priorities are as a school, where your problems are, and what are the alternative programs available. So Success for All is one example of a program to improve reading, I think, in primary schools, but there are other programs as well, and the school has to weigh that up. Is Nudge a replacement for school expenditure in the more traditional types of policies? I think definitely not. I think we saw already in David's presentation that although some of these things are incredibly cost effective because they're very low cost, they don't produce massive benefits. As many things don't produce massive benefits. But you have to try and think of a sort of package of things. But we've seen so much good research evidence showing that expenditure really does matter for achievement, and we have a lot of anecdotal evidence talking to teachers about just how much that's affecting schools. So all the good nudges, low-cost interventions, small benefit interventions you can have is not going to replace the fact that expenditure is really reducing in this area, and it really matters. And then finally, the issue about gender. Well, I'm not expert on nudge approaches generally, but I would say that for experimental work and evaluations, that whether or not things affect boys or girls, I wouldn't say there's always a systematic difference by gender. It depends on exactly what the intervention is as to whether it affects boys or girls differently or the same. But I do think there are particular issues where these sorts of approaches might make a difference. One of the things that I'm looking into at the moment is why women don't do engineering in great numbers. So it might be that there's some I'd be interested to know whether there are programs out there that can influence that information programs or career guidance programs, for example.
I was told that economics was now worse in terms of gender split than engineering. Is that true? It is, yeah. I hate to say that. It tears me apart. So we have a real problem in culture. So thank God you're here. You're rare. and David.
Very good. To rattle through some of these. Do we have the answer in relation to adoption? No. All the What Works centres wrestle with this. This is one of the great unanswered questions. What is it work? And even the mighty EEF, Educational Endowment Fund, just published recently an 8-arm trial testing different ways of presenting information. The basic line, nothing seemed to work very well. Would it be relevant? Behaviour of Ofsted possibly goes to the question of what do you do when something isn't working. One of the really interesting sort of soft hypotheses is that when Chris or someone takes part in a trial, it may be that the meta thing that happens is that it's not that the trial itself leads to a result, but if it makes Chris more attuned to what constitutes good evidence, then that's the really big win. And it's a soft hypothesis that in medicine, that's what it matters, is that it's become built in that people become able to. In fact, there's a wonderful trial, and the Uganda trial on can you teach kids to be better bullshit detectors, which is an amazingly strong, interesting result. We might want to apply that more generally. On some of the other quick questions, absolutely is complementary. Remember, even Cass, who was roughly my opposite number in the White House, he sat there basically working on regulation, and his narrative, interestingly in contrast to ours in the UK, political narrative, was that how can you make regulation better, for example, when you use behaviour. So, or you're using an incentive. Well, how can you taper it and design it to make it more impactful? Which is why there's slightly mixed blessing with Nudge, Unit Nudge as a title, because it gets you into a very narrow band of interventions, which hopefully you get a sense this evening, actually, the power of this is not in a narrow but a broader way. Gender, God, I don't know. I mean, one of the issues is partly because we often can't see the data. We often can't see gender effects as a truth of it for government work, unlike Cambridge Analytica. And so that raises all kinds of questions about what we could or couldn't do. We certainly know there are lots of incredibly powerful effects where if you remind people of their gender, then they start acting to stereotype. Because famous example, if you remind, in North America, girls that they're girls before they do a maths test, they do worse. If, on the other hand, you take Asian girls in the US and remind them they're Asian, we know that they do better than average. Obviously, there's ongoing work with Gabby and gender, etc., blah, blah, blah. Public health, absolutely. Look, we're incredibly interested in that as an area. One of the things that sits over all of this area is, we know, as Gus said at the beginning, why don't we follow the etiology upstream, which is why, do stuff on obesity or smoking cessation, unbelievably effective, compared to many other quite expensive interventions. Sometimes they're individual. Quite often they actually take you to a systemic sort of intervention. Mental health has some of those same characteristics. I think many of us think it's kind of crazy, right, the cost-benefit analysis there. One challenge is, by the way, to make sure that public health nonetheless does have the same methodological rigor that we see elsewhere. I should kind of closing comment, I was reflecting on the question earlier about what's the simple model for, behavioural science. Actually, the simple phrase is often, we're not rational, we're rationalising. That is the predominant characteristic of what goes on in our head. I often think, Danny Kahneman often characterises thinking fast, thinking slow. The presumption is the thinking slow is the really rational, we weigh up all the evidence carefully. But if you actually listen to the voice in your own head, even highly educated folks, there's even Andy Haldane here, how rational and smart is he sat in the room? But even for him, probably, actually, if you listen to the voice in your head, what it's brilliant at doing is coming up with why what you did was the right thing. So you came home and you forgot to, you left all the crap and you left it in the sink and you should have cleared up and you didn't, and your partner says, hey, why didn't you clear up? Like that, your brain will come up with a plausible explanation of why you had an incredibly important other thing to do. That is, if you can introspect, that is the dominant human characteristic, actually, is we don't have a natural scientist in our head, or even a good economist. We have a press officer. So you can't just blame the politicians. It is a kind of human thing. And one of the things we look to education is to make a slightly lesser press officer. By conclusion, I just bring the stuff about why this matters. I just say, it's not really the nudge thing or even behavioural science. The most important thing that's being discussed in this room is the application of better methods to whatever we do, right? Forget the behavioural science. Is the incentive effective? Is it not? Is it, the structural interventions effective or not? And it's definitely not RCTs. But still, sometimes I go back to the original, sometimes cited randomised control trial, which is how we discovered scurvy, right? There's sorry, guys. No. But there's a beautiful new book actually out by Andrew Lee, who's actually, he's a parliamentarian in Australia, an economist who now is a parliamentarian. Anyway, it's called the randomistas or whatever. And he starts with the example of the 7-Year War, basically sets it up. So the 7-Year War, the British recruited, I think, 177,000 sailors from memory. I think that's about right. Anyway, an interesting question. Well, how many of them died in combat? 7 years. It turns out, do you know what the estimate would be? Anybody? It's about 1,500. Less than 1% died in combat. How many of them died from scurvy? 20%? No. 133,000. 72%. 72%. Right? And the British Navy's treatment was basically a dose of, I think, sulfuric acid, etc. Eventually, of course, we all know, someone eventually did a 6-arm, what we now call a 6-arm trial, and figured out we'll give a bit of citrus, and it turns out, the reason why, basically, you can argue we didn't get, we won Trafalgar, was because our sailors weren't sick, and they were on the other side. Still, the question is, it took decades for it to be adopted. And the question is, we must be surrounded by examples of modern equivalents of scurvy, where we haven't actually figured out whether the treatment is harming or hindering, let alone might be a better thing to do. So we shouldn't look back and just say it's ancient history. I'm afraid it's around us all the time. And if pro bono economics can do something to get into a world where we are actually systematically looking at impact, I mean, it may sound geeky, but honestly, God, in terms of radical change, that would really change the world for the better.
And the scurvy example, there are plenty of other medical examples, particularly to do with surgery. If you're squeamish, don't go there. Just turns out how many of these things that are being done based on no evidence whatsoever, and they're now beginning to realise, as they actually do the experiments, that actually they leave you worse off than you were before, which is a bit scary. But I was going to say that if we think these things are taking some time to kind of feed through, don't worry. The scurvy thing, I think it was, I mean, the results were known, and it was decades before they actually implemented the policy, which is just absolutely staggering. Thank you all, the panel. Please show your appreciation to them all. Before I hand over to Julia Grant, so a last few words as the CEO of Pro Bono Economics. Just one point when people talk about Nudge being small, remember the self-enrollment example, that if you try and get the same impact on savings from using standard tax reliefs, it's billions, multiple billions. If anyone ever tells you nudges are about small things, I can give you other examples where we could change tax reliefs, actually mostly abolish them, and provide billions, almost with no loss. Julia, over to you.
Thank you, Gus. So I'm Julia Grant, and I'm the Chief Executive of Pro Bono Economics. And the sad part of my task is to declare the formal part of the evening closed, but the happy part is to invite you to join us to have a drink and continue the conversation next door. But before we do that, and I won't detain you too long, I do want to give very special thanks to David for a spirited canter through Nudge, and to Sandra and to Chris for really helping us understand it in the broader context of research and from the field, from the grassroots of the classroom, if you will. And thanks also to our sponsors this evening, Nomura, and to YouGov, who helped us compile a really interesting survey of the public's view on some of these issues, to Sensor Communications for their media support and the fabulous tweet beam, and also to my team. We've been working on this for 6 months, and believe you me, it's a tremendous achievement in terms of the support they've given me. And finally, to all of you for supporting the event and for engaging so well in the discussion afterwards. So I'll just leave you with one reflection on what I heard this evening, going back to my hobby horse about inspirational teaching. And I was thinking about my favourite teacher who taught me romantic poetry in English. And did we look at text? Yeah, eventually we did. But not before he'd lugged in his portable record player and took us through a musical journey from Mozart to Beethoven, just to give a sense of the passion and the challenge that lay behind that work. And to this day, Mr. O'Connell, whenever I read poetry or listen music to music from that era, I think of you. So here's the challenge to the panel and something Pro Bono Economics would love to be part of. If good teaching is about stimulation and about explanation, isn't it also about the power to surprise? And how could we go about valuing that? And Pro Bono would be loved to be part of that. Since we were founded by Andy Haldane and Martin Brooks in 2009, we've engaged over 500 professional economists volunteering their skills to help explain some of the wicked issues that face society today. And we're keen to do so much more. So if you're interested in volunteering and you want to scratch that itch, then just get in touch with us, either tonight or via our website. If you want to promote our work, please use our hashtag from tonight, @Nudge-u-cation, and promote our work more widely to colleagues. And take time to read our reports. They're all published on our website, and we'd love to get your views and reactions to them. And finally, whatever your profession, if you're interested in donating to Pro Bono Economics, you can help support us to scale our work and help tackle even more of the wicked issues in society. So thank you, and please join us for a drink.